Okay, actually, so I'm going to put in the chat a link to the slides that I'm going to show, as well as the Bootstrap CLT Startup Toolkit, which is just kind of a set of documents that we hope others can use. So for folks who have already CLTs going or trying to start one, we hope that these documents will be helpful for you all in your journey. And again, I'm going to like squeeze like 4 years of our journey on the CLT into like 30 minutes. So it's not going to cover everything. And again, I'll put this recording in the folder itself too. So if you want to go back and reference it, you can later. And I'm going to share my screen and just go through a quick agenda. Okay, can y'all see my screen? I'm going to take that as yes.
Yes.
Okay, so Indianapolis Community Land Trust. So we're just the agenda. I'm going to give a little bit of the KEPRA story. So again, I've been a part of KEPRA for about 13 years, and KEPRA Institute is a community leadership development organization with a focus on young people, but very intergenerational, and all kinds of projects from community gardens to supporting Black and brown entrepreneurs and cooperatives to helping start the Indianapolis Community Land Trust, really our classrooms for us to develop leaders, both young people and also our community's leadership, as we try to build the relationships and systems to create the kind of worlds that we want to live in. And again, shout outs out on the call. We got Mrs. Paulette Fair, who's one of the co-founders and OGs in the space. So we definitely stand on their shoulders. So I'll do a very short 4-minute clip of a video that's the KEPRA story. Then we'll look at the Indianapolis Community Land Trust and our journey to help start that in Indianapolis. We'll go through the Bootstrap CLT Startup Toolkit, what's in there. Also talk about the potentials and limits of CLTs as a tool. We will look at the membership model that we're using here or planning on using, seller leverage program, homebuyer choice program, property taxes, and there's a couple other topics and questions that we'll go through. And again, feel free to just stop me and like jump in with questions. Let's start with the video.
Community means something different round here. Love's breeding ground born new, blossoming into barraging stories of blackness, banter, and bustle through blues like blood couldn't make us any closer. This be communion.
Growing community is like growing food. It's a lot of work. You got to till the soil. You got to plant the seeds. You got to have the right weather conditions. So community is just like that. You start with what you have where you are.
KEPRA is a nonprofit grassroots organization that was created roughly about 20 years ago. And when it was created by my father, my mother, and my godmother. They're the 3 co-founders. And they created it to help me, Miss Paulette's grandson, my lifelong, he's like a brother, Ijaz. Some of my partners I grew up with, Jerome and Jerome, in my neighborhood. It's basically like, how do we create a formal experience for these young Black men to grow, thrive?
The birth of KEPRA is about, again, inherently, the crux of KEPRA is tied to liberation and freedom. Freedom to me is having a goal or goals, aspirations, dreams, visions, and missions, and being able to have the opportunity to fulfill those goals, aspirations, visions, and missions.
Empowerment means to me like you get something right. You do what you want to do. You figure out what's your goal and you set your goal.
Running to get it like I'm in the Olympics, but there is no finish. We gotta keep going, so I set the pace. Handle with grace, the person I need to be leading the race. Ballin' like I never balled before. Flexing forever like 24. Taking the keys, open all the doors. Liners that cover up all the sores. Give it your best and the world adores. This is for certain, I'm so for sure.
We live in a culture, when you think of wealth, you think of money. How much money you got? What's your credit rating? Do you have any intergenerational wealth? Do you own a home ownership, blah, 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 blah. If you're not careful when you think community wealth, then the folks start thinking, oh, you're talking about how rich your community is, how much fiscal assets does it have. But wealth itself really is much broader than that. It's your intellectual wealth. You know, what kind of information do you know? Others in your community, what do they know? Breadth and depth of your relationship with others in your community. Spiritual wealth, faith, your heart, music, art, you know, those things all make up wealth in your community.
Okay, I'm gonna stop it there, but we will drop the link to the rest of the video in the chat. So
Hey, Alvin, sorry, just to butt in, if we could just slow down for the interpreters.
thank you for the reminder.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thank you. Appreciate it.
Awesome. So one of the things that, along with leadership development, that really is Kepra's focus is lately we've talked about community wealth building. So the idea of expanding our idea of wealth as being individual, but being community, really a community asset and relationship with each other, as well as having a lot of different aspects that are beyond financial. So there's cultural capital, social capital, our relationships and our connection to each other, our intellectual capital, the folks that we know who know things that can help support what we're trying to do as a community. And that kind of leads to the Indianapolis Community Land Trust and the history of how that really got started. So like I said before, Kepra's different projects really are classrooms for leadership development, many of which are brought by folks in our community who think something needs to happen, or young people who are passionate about something. So in this case, back in 2018, we had two of our friends in community, Andy Beck and Wildstyle, who came to Kepra talking about this organization called Right to the City and Community Land Trusts, and Kepra should think about joining and think about doing something like that. So we joined Right to the City back then after several conversations over several months with Right to the City folks. And that's when we really started creating the Indianapolis Homes for All Coalition. And there was also some other folks in Indianapolis who were also thinking about starting a community land trust. So we kind of started these monthly meetings with different people from around the city, thinking about how we could make it happen. And I think really my journey with the in housing and community land trust started about 4 years ago. And again, and just a little more about myself, like been a part of Kepra for about 13 years. And kind of my archetype is like, hey, we can do it. Let's get it done. Let's figure it out. But I think with the housing piece, like the more that I learned about housing, the more I realized it wasn't about housing. Housing is not the root problem of what's creating the housing crisis. That really, and I really like reading Evicted, reading Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, which really takes racism outside of people's individual attitudes or behaviors, but looking at it as a way that our society is purposely structured. So these three books were very influential in understanding or deepening my understanding and our understanding collectively about how a racial caste system is really the root source and cause of the exploitation of renters and low-wage workers to take wealth from communities, certain communities, and transfer it to other communities. the, and the other book I'll mention, Born in Blackness, really talks about the history of how the modern world was created, centering the role of Africa and Africans, in particular in the trade of gold, and then later in the trade of enslaved Africans, and how that really is the cornerstone basis on which our society, worldview, and economy are based. And really, like, it talks a lot about the creation of markets. Like sugar was created only through the basically sacrificing people to produce it because it was so brutal, and that created value for people who had capital. And that the same model exists now in industrialization and our current wage economy, and really connecting it to evicted in particular. If you don't have ownership of land, then you're forced to rent. And if you're forced to rent, you're forced to work, to like have a job that often paid lower wages. So again, you're forced to work these wages that are then your wealth is extracted through your housing and through your job. And again, that really is trying to make the through line connection between really what is at the root of the housing crisis. So again, yeah, this is the diagnosis. And again, this comes in thinking about our strategy to what we do about it, that exploitation in housing is fundamentally driven by the current distribution and access to capital, which was and is determined by a racial caste system. So I'm gonna shift gears a little bit and talk about this Bootstrap CLT startup toolkit. There's a lot of stuff in it. It's like not super well organized, but some things that are in there is an article that we're about to talk about, which talks about the potentials and limitations of community land trusts as tools. The ground lease and deed restriction, which we created with the assistance of like our consultant, lawyers, bylaws, and membership structure. Our 1023 IRS application, which is what you file in order to start a new 501c3 nonprofit. Training recordings from our CLT advisory board. So we worked with Grounded Solutions, Jason Webb, for about 14 months. And he did, I think, like 10 or 12 trainings with our advisory board, going through every part of community land trusts, things that you should understand and kind of decisions that you make along the way that we want to make available again to anyone who wants to use it, so that you don't have to pay a consultant maybe in order to get the same kind of resources and information. Some homebuyer choice, which is the pilot project I'm going to share more about, seller leverage program, which I'll share more about, qualified capital improvements policy, and much more. So again, this is the reading. It's only 4 pages in it that I think does a really good job of summarizing the potentials, but also the limitations of community land trusts. So the practical potentials, and I'll try and slow down, sorry, that it provides are: 1, community control through a governance structure. And that's the tripartite board that Casey mentioned earlier, the CLT board being made out of 1/3 residents, 1/3 community members, and 1/3 of other supporters. So you're really creating an organization or institution that is not one individual person, but is a structure that theoretically, based on how it's created, should represent the interests of our community. The second is permanent affordability tool that is very flexible, that can be used for single family, multifamily, and other land uses. And a part of that advantage is that it can get around not in my backyard sentiment and stigma around affordable housing and public housing, because again, home ownership is more politically palatable, particularly in more conservative political environments, as well as it looks just like, particularly if you're doing single family homes, it looks just like everyone else's houses and homes, and is often could be totally invisible. The political potential, and this is a quote that I'll just read. The first CLT was created in Albany, Georgia by organizers from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and was born of efforts to enable Black farmers to have more control over their land. Black power organizers in Albany, who were motivated by the goals of community-controlled social change, borrowed from different land reform movements to create the first CLT. They did so not as a tool for affordable housing, but rather, as the CLT's founders put it, so that a legitimate, quote, a legitimate alternative institutional expression of land ownership may be found, thereby contributing to the much needed social and economic reconstruction of America. And the reason I find this to be powerful is similar to what Casey shared earlier, is the idea of, well, Adrian talked about a spectrum, and that the idea that CLTs can be used as a tool to change housing, but also change our culture and our relationship to each other, and start to try and reimagine what housing and the economy can look like. The practical, oh, also one thing it talks about also in the article is that a lot of CLTs have become part of the affordable housing industrial complex. So again, many of them can be used. You can use a CLT for community, and you can use a CLT to develop affordable housing. And the idea that sometimes we're not always taking advantage of the transformative and community piece. Practical limitations: the number of housing units on CLT land remains small, approximately 12,000 units. And this was written a number of years ago, so I'm sure it's more than that right now. With difficulties arising from the need for substantial upfront subsidies, difficulties acquiring land, and bureaucratic resistance. In some, inequity and exploitation in housing are rooted in unequal distribution and access to capital, which was and is determined by a racial caste system. CLTs don't create capital or change this fundamentally. So community land trust is a tool to basically create our own housing market that we decide the rules are and we govern it, but it doesn't create money out of nowhere. It doesn't fundamentally solve the deeper challenge of access to capital and who has capital currently. So that's just something really important thing to keep in mind. Political limitations. Politically, the current orientations of many CLTs towards pragmatic apolitical activities focused on property acquisition for home ownership limits their radical potential for social change. And the article highlights the need for reevaluation of the political aims of the CLT movement to fully realize its transformative potential. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our membership structure, and members are the community owners of the CLT, nominated and elected, and they are nominated to and elect the board of directors in membership organizations. So the types of members: resident members who live on CLT properties, general members, supporting members. And the way in our model that we've created, which I'll go more into, the responsibilities of members is to pledge to contact the CLT if selling property, for those who do own property, to donate and or volunteer, and to build community and relationships with each other. So this is just a graphic of the membership model that we're putting together under the idea of creating our own housing market. Again, on the left, supporting members, which is any individual or institution, which makes up 1/3 of the board. They donate a certain amount of money and also get recognized potentially on the website. And they also pledge to contact the CLT before selling any properties that they own. General members are folks who are under 80% of the area median income that live in Indianapolis. And the goal of that is to try and, within that general member category, since it is a citywide community land trust, to put some parameters on there in terms of income and where people live, so that they represent generally the folks CLT is trying to serve. And again, they donate a certain amount of money a year, like $10 a month, and or volunteer, which could include attending meetings. And these folks can also apply to become CLT residents. The idea is we're trying to get members, and then we'll inform members about opportunities as they come up for housing. The third category is residential members. So again, under 80% of the AMI and lives on the CLT land. They pay the $50 a month, and it's actually a ground lease fee that supports the projects. And then we'll talk about these other programs in a second. So a seller leverage example. So this is the two actual examples of folks who've approached us about selling properties into the community land trust. So seller leverage means that people are selling or donating property, selling at a discount or donating property, which basically creates equity for the next person that might make it possible for someone at a lower income to purchase a home that wouldn't otherwise be possible, that we wouldn't have resources to do. So one example is Julia, who owns the house that's pictured there. That's in Irvington, which is a pretty rapidly gentrifying neighborhood in Indianapolis. She came to a presentation and contacted us. She bought the house for $200,000 in 2018, even though it's worth $300,000. She was interested to see, hey, could we sell it to you for what we bought it for, which was $200,000. And the motivation for her was one, they have resources, so they're building a new house and they're able to carry both. So financially, they're in a position that they don't have to sell it for the full market value, and they don't want to contribute to gentrification in their neighborhood and want another family to enjoy the home. The second example is from Janine, who's a part owner of a low-income housing tax credit project with approximately 32 units of 2 bedrooms each. They contacted us to see if the CLT might be a partner to help sell the homes to the current renters when the tax credit period expires in 2025. And the CLT basically provides that institution for people to come to facilitate. One, these people can get a tax incentive for selling below the market value, which is a benefit to them and also a benefit to community, because going back to that main diagnosed problem is the distribution of capital is really fundamentally what the root cause is of the housing crisis and exploitation. And this is one way that people can willingly transfer equity to folks who don't have equity and create an opportunity for people who are stuck renting to own a house and start to build equity. So that's a second component of the pilot that we're launching in the next month is a home buyer choice program, which is based very closely off of Houston Community Land Trust or HoustonCLT.org if you want to learn more. We had a lot of conversation over the years with Dr. Ashley Allen, who's the director and is really awesome and been super helpful for our learning. So what a home buyer choice project does is instead of building houses, people buy houses that are on the market, and the CLT brings cash basically to reduce the price to the home buyer. So as an example, we will bring up to $100,000 in subsidies to reduce the mortgage of the home. They have to purchase a turnkey home for sale on the market anywhere in Marion County. As an example, so a $180K home could be bought by a CLT home buyer who can afford a mortgage of $80,000. The future sale price would be limited to our resale formula, which is 2% every year appreciation on what they buy it for. So if they buy it for $80,000, it'll appreciate 2% every year. So that again, it's balancing the benefit to the one household with the benefit for future households and the community as a whole. And part of the reasons, I don't know if that's on the next slide. Okay, the reasons why we went with this program is one, we're not developers, we're not house builders. And in conversation with some partners, construction costs have gotten really crazy. I think one of the partners projects we were looking at was $400,000 for a townhome to build new construction. And we are looking at Zillow and houses that are for sale on the market in our neighborhood that have been renovated and are in decent shape for $200,000 or $170,000. So we're saying, hey, based off our capacity and also based off what makes sense economically, we're going to start with a pilot that's based off of doing a home buyer choice program and convert market rate homes into community ownership. The 2% resale formula is the reasons we went with that was it's simple. It doesn't require getting an appraisal. So there's a number, and again, a lot of these resources are in those training videos that I discussed. There's a whole one or two sessions on resale formulas. But a lot of people are gravitating now toward fixed rate formulas because it's simple, doesn't require you get an appraisal to tell people how much they're going to sell their house for. They know it's on paper. You can use a spreadsheet and know exactly how much people can sell their home for. It also basically makes housing prices rise in alignment with inflation and wages. So the way we got to 2% was we looked at Indianapolis's average increases in wages over the last 10 years, which is approximately 4%. So if there's no drastic change in that, homes will remain affordable and may become more affordable over time relative to wages. So the idea is we want to just make the resale formula below the wage growth of 4%. We also decided we would target for the income folks who are under 60% of the area median income. And this is just a chart that shows what that is for Indianapolis. So again, for a single person, that's $40,000, and it's a little more depending on the size of the household from there. And the reason for focusing on that is really looking at the disproportionate impact on folks who make less money in the housing market. So this is just a quote from a recent report that half of renters in Marion County earn $35,000 or less annually, but only an estimated 35% of the county's multifamily rental units are affordable to them. And this disproportionately affects households of color. So that really for us, the goal is to focus the CLT on folks who are not able to access homeownership, because we want folks, if they can buy a house on the market and want to do that, like, the more power to them, they will make more equity individually that way. But I think what we're trying to look at is how can we focus our resources on folks who would be stuck renting so that they can start building equity, and we can also start to create our own housing market that really prioritizes people and the people who are most left out of accessing capital and housing. This is again, this flow chart is in the Bootstrap CLT model. This is a flow chart about our application process. And again, to understand, how does it work from beginning to end for people? I won't go through everything. I'll just say people learn about it through our community, through website, through outreach. We have a screening form that looks at basically, are they under the 60% AMI limit, in which case they would attend like a CLT 201 to learn more, to make sure they're clear on how it works. Attend a home buyer education course, complete the CLT application, request mortgage pre-approval. So once they get pre-approved by one of our mortgage lenders, then they're accepted on a first come, first served basis. They receive a approval letter with their maximum amount of what they can shop for a house. And that's, again, what they can afford on their mortgage, plus the up to 100,000 that the CLT is going to bring. Select a realtor. They meet with Indy CLT meets with their realtor to make sure they're clear, receive a blank purchase agreement addendum, select a home and make an offer. We will review the property to make sure it fits the criteria of not needing major repairs in the first 5 years. Properties approved, they have to meet with an attorney, which we'll pay for, just to make sure they're very clear on the ground lease and the terms, closing, and then they are part of the CLT as homeowners. An important other component, property taxes. So again, there are two, we're still working through this totally, but one of the challenges that we've run into is achieving two objectives. One is to assess the properties at the affordable restricted price, not the fair market value. This is fair because homeowners can't sell for the market value, so they shouldn't be taxed at that level. We have been able to, I think, come again through our attorneys negotiating with the Marion County assessor to be able to create a process for that. The second that we're still working on is to give the homeowners the homestead deduction to reduce their tax rate as their primary residence. So for Indiana, if you use it as your primary residence, if your property taxes are 1% annually per year versus 2%. So it basically cuts it in. And if you're doing cooperatives or rental properties, the goal would be to get them reduced or exempted entirely. Okay, other topics and lessons learned. So a big part of our approach has been a lot of relationship building. So first with folks like you all on the call through Right to the City, Houston Community Land Trust, City of Lakes Community Land Trust in Minneapolis, just a whole lot of phone calls, a lot of reading and research with folks who are doing it in other cities, as well as locally, to understand kind of the ecosystem and who's doing what, and understanding kind of the opportunities and the challenges that people face. I definitely think the planning grants. So if you can find, so we got $400,000 in startup funding from the city of Indianapolis, again, through our relationship with the former deputy mayor over community development. Again, we had a relationship with him over years so that when the American Rescue Plan funds came down, he asked us for a proposal. So we gave him a proposal. They didn't give us everything we wanted, but we were able to get the money to do startup funding. So if you can get that, I think that's a great way to start and give you time to figure it out and to put something together. Again, this is what we came to that worked, we think will work for Indianapolis. That makes sense. But again, it might look different depending on where you are. Some readings that I'll just pull out that I think were good for our strategy development. Good Strategy, Bad Strategy by Richard Rummelt, which I think really looks at what is strategy, which again goes back to that diagnosing the problem and ensuring that whatever you're creating addresses that underlying problem, and that the actions you're creating all are coordinated to address that. The concept of think slow and act fast comes from a book called How Big Things Get Done. And really, I think this has been really helpful for us. If we had launched in the first couple of years before we had resources and had any idea what we're doing, it could have totally been a disaster. So really, I think taking the time to learn, to build relationships, even though it feels kind of arduous, and at some point you're like, hey, are we going to do anything? Are we actually going to do this community land trust? You balance the tension between acting and really thinking it through. And really that concept is once you start to put shovels in the ground, that's when disasters can happen. That your planning is relatively safe time, but when you start to implement, that's when things can go awry. The ground lease versus deed restriction. So we had a long time going back and forth between ground lease versus deed restriction because of some legal stuff around property taxes. We eventually went with a ground lease because it's the most durable in case of foreclosure. So in case of foreclosure, deed restrictions are wiped out, whereas with a ground lease, the CLT still owns the land under the house and can negotiate with the bank to get the property back into the community ownership. So that was probably the main reason, as well as the philosophical idea that community land trusts are about community ownership of land, and deed restrictions, at least in Indiana, can only last 30 years. So if someone stayed in the house for 30 years, it would go away. The role of consultants, we've worked with a number of consultants over the years, again, thanks to having a planning grant to be able to do so was helpful because, and again, you can do this by talking to people who've done it and having them share what they do with you, and you can kind of riff off that, which again, we welcome you to borrow, steal any of the stuff that's in the startup toolkit. But we worked with Ground Solutions that did those trainings that I mentioned. Again, they are kind of a national source that for community land trust consulting and networking and stuff. I would say right now, a lot of their focus is on larger scale. And that was one of the tensions. And I think we worked with a really good, Jason Webb was really helpful for our process. But again, his organization is really kind of conflicted right now between doing large scale projects versus community rooted kind of CLTs, which we're a smaller group. And we have 5 units, whereas they're looking at hundreds of units. But I think definitely follow them for the model ground lease for different templates that they have, I think is the best role. We're also working with a consultant now, Jeff Washburn with Burlington Associates. Burlington Associates is the other big national CLT consulting firm. We found it to be very helpful to work with Jeff from the technical perspective. So he was very upfront that he is not the community facilitator kind of consultant. He is someone he was the former director of City of Lakes Community Land Trust in Minneapolis for about 20 years, and really was more providing his experiences from just doing it and documents and legal stuff like that. Software, we are using a Salesforce software add-on called Homekeeper, which keeps track of, again, I think having some robust system to track. You could do it on spreadsheets if it's small, but again, probably if you have the resources to start with a tool like Salesforce, where your relationships are all tracked in a system designed for CLT. So it tracks kind of the resale. It's like got all kinds of stuff in it. If you want to look it up, just search Homekeeper Salesforce. We're also using a tool called Public House, which is a separate plugin that handles more of a like an online electronic application where people can upload their documents. And you can kind of communicate back and forth with applicants. Again, I think that part probably is not as necessary, but we had the resources, we wanted to keep it as electronic and automated as possible. Repair reserve, we also decided to add, and this is what Houston CLT does. They add an extra, I think, $50 a month, $50 or $100 a month, in addition to the ground lease, as kind of a forced savings account for people, again, really for the property, for long-term roof repair. Again, like a lot of people, including myself, don't have $10,000 to shell out in savings if like a roof needs repaired. So the idea is that this fund would build over time, and as people need to make repairs, they can apply or submit something to the CLT to get all or part of it covered by the repair reserve. Specifically, it's for the exterior maintenance of the home. And then mortgage lenders. So another part of this model requires onboarding mortgage lenders, which we actually did not have a problem with, even though we're one of the first CLTs in Indiana. Right now, in particular, with interest rates high, banks are starving for mortgages. So a lot of them have, at least here, no down payment options that have fairly low minimum credit scores of like 620 or 640. So just again, through relationship building and looking at your options, there's also kind of a list of national lenders that lend to CLTs that also include in the toolkit. And I'm just going to open it up for questions. And this is our team email, clt@kepler.org. So again, afterwards, we'd be happy to have a conversation on Zoom, kind of like this, and or answer questions that you have. We also were fortunate, I'm going to stop my screen sharing, to have a bunch of folks, Darnell, Renee, Kale and Maddie and Annette, who were just here in Indianapolis doing like an exchange learning trip. So again, if you have questions or want to add in anything that you learned that you think I left out, we'll open it up. Go ahead, Abdidan.
Wow, that has to be the best presentation I've ever seen on community land trusts. And I've put together a few of my own. So like for real, like a round of applause to you, Alvin, and to Kepper, because I mean, it really just made everything so incredibly clear. I wanted to ask you the funds for that, I forget exactly the terminology used, but the program where you give a home buyer $100,000, right, to purchase land, to purchase a property off the open market. Where do the funds come from to do that program?
So that came from an application that we made to the Indianapolis African American Quality of Life Initiative. So Eli Lilly, which is the big pharmaceutical company in Indianapolis, donated $100 million to improve Black quality of life to the National Urban League to re-grant out to folks. Housing was one of those areas. So we applied in partnership with a local community development financial institution, and we're able to get $400,000 to do it. Again, that's helpful because it's not government and it's a lot less restrictive than something like, you know, other options. And again, we're looking at applying for this too in the fall. Community development block grants or federal home funds, I think could also be used as quote down payment assistance, again, through the lens of community land trusts. Those are other options for funding. But again, it's been very helpful to be able to find non-government, not as restrictive sources.
Yeah, thanks, Alvin.
If we'll have more money after that, who knows? If people want to support it, it'll keep going. If not, then like, who knows? Go ahead, Ray. Were you asking a question?
Yeah, thanks for that presentation, man. That was awesome presentation. But now I have a lot of questions. But I'm gonna ask a couple. You know, so first of all, what is the time process from start to till you get the shovels in the ground is the first question. Second question is there on-ground support? Like the presentation is nice, but like, is there on-ground support to help get this started in the research? Third question is like, what's the capacity? Like, we don't just organize around housing. So we organize around a plethora of different things, but housing trust, social housing, and co-op housing is something that we're really trying to get off the ground. So like, what's the capacity look like? And how should we be looking at building capacity around that, building partnerships around that? And then similar to Adrian, like, how do we begin to thinking about the funding sources in the beginning of the planning part? Where does that come from? Do we work with the city budget? Do we work with foundations, philanthropy? Do we rehab? Like, what's the process for looking at understanding and explaining what that funding and how that looks?
Okay, so
It's all for now. We can set up another meeting for everything else I got.
yeah, absolutely. So happy to talk outside of the meeting and go a little deeper with folks. So from start to finish, again, it really started in 2018 in exploring, and I've been a part of the project for about 4 years now. So again, a lot of, and it also was helpful when resources became available. So that was really, there wasn't any like money to pay staff. Kepler kind of just like, as part of our work, like your work and supporting like community initiatives, like tried to, and we really think of Kepler as kind of like a think tank, a community think tank and leadership development organization to figure out, okay. And that was kind of a dance for a long time to figure out the difference between Kepra's work and the Indianapolis Community Land Trust. So Kepra, we have used housing that's separate, again, totally separate from this, for housing like young leaders and also like other community projects that really are separate from the CLT, because the CLT is a mechanism to create community ownership and control in a way that's governed in kind of perpetuity. But Kepler already has that for our properties through our own governance and our own organizational mechanisms. So kind of when we kind of understood, okay, we're really creating a platform that's separate from us, that can live or die on its own, and potentially leverage resources that we couldn't necessarily leverage. Really, we're not creating like the perfect thing that we would do for like our own housing, but we're creating a mechanism through which people can create their own housing market and ideally leverage equity from individual people who want to become members, like Julia in the example, who might want to have some place where they can sell their property at a discount and keep it in community ownership. Yeah, so I think that's the answer to the first one. Again, it was like 4 years capacity it required. Really, it was, I think for a long time, really like me primarily kind of learning, like for at least a solid year of like researching online. I don't know, like 15, 20 hours a week of like learning, reading, calling, emailing. And a lot of times when you email people, they're like happy to meet with you. Most people, if you just like shoot them an email, like not everybody, but like a majority of folks. I think also I'm going to do a shout out to the Minnesota CLT Coalition does a really good conference every fall that we've gone to twice in a row. And about half of the participants come from outside of Minnesota. And it's really stuff around technical stuff, around the home buyer choice program. How does it work? Kind of policies you need. It's like just a lot of kind of more how-to nuts and bolts to it that I think was helpful. Yeah, I'm trying to, can you reframe any ones I didn't answer?
Yeah, sorry,
Take it out, Marlboro.
I do want to butt in here, just because we are a quarter over the hour, and then Margot and Vero, who are interpreters, they graciously agreed to stay on for the extra 15 minutes. But and I should also say they are both on vacation, so we super appreciate them for staying on a little bit longer, and then for all of y'all for staying on as well. But I'm gonna actually just say that we probably need to wrap it here. I do want to flag Kale put something in the chat. I think Kale's was with somebody named Maddie and y'all are from Kentucky. Alvin, maybe could I connect you, or are you already connected with them to maybe? to like answer any questions about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Cool.
Dale and Maddie, you got Annette, and you got our email and our team's email. So happy to talk more in depth. And I put the answer in the chat to that specific question.
And y'all, maybe we can start like an email thread just in case anybody has other follow-up questions that we weren't able to get to today because we were a little over time. But yeah, Alvin, before closing it out, are there any like last words or kind of other points that you want to like leave the group with?
Keep it simple.
Cool. All right, y'all. Yeah, let's give some love to Alvin. And man, Indianapolis showed up big today. Y'all brought a ton of folks on this call. It's good to see so many people here. Really appreciate folks staying on for the little bit of extra time as well. Y'all stay cool, stay hydrated. I'll see some of y'all next week in LA. And then the rest of y'all, I'm sure I'm going to be seeing you and talking to you pretty soon as well. All right, y'all.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, Alvin.
Catch you later. Thanks, Renee.